seventh Sunday after Easter, but I'm going to be a little bit rebellious with the text that I base my message on. What I mean is that Thursday was a very important day in the life of the church, but if you blinked, you might have missed it. And if you weren't even aware that it was a special day, well, you're kind of to be excused on that count as well, because Protestants, at least, don't make much of Ascension Day. That is what we marked on Thursday. But we don't just flash past so fast that we forget about it. This is the Sunday of the Ascension, even though the day itself was actually on Thursday. So I'm going to preach on that great theme. The texts for the day of Ascension are my texts for today. Luke chapter 24. I'm going to narrow it to verses 44 to 53. And then Acts, the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 1, verses 1 to 11. Keep in mind that Luke and Acts are kind of two chapters of the same book. They have the same author. He has the same purpose, to bear witness to Jesus Christ first in the Gospels, in the Gospel of Luke, by telling us about the life and the words of Jesus while he's on earth. And then, of course, Jesus is still on earth for the first few verses in Acts chapter 1, but then he leaves, he departs, as he's told his disciples he's going to do. He ascends rather dramatically into heaven. And from then on, the Acts of the Apostles continues to be the story of Jesus, but it is the story of Jesus as it is being lived out in the lives or the acts of the apostles. Jesus now being present everywhere, not just in one place, through the power of the Holy Spirit that comes from the Father and the Son, just as Jesus promised. So if you haven't already had a chance to do so, this would be a good time to pause the video and read those passages that are coupled together for today from Luke and from the Acts of the Apostles. We'll take a pause. You take whatever time you need, and then we'll come back at it. Okay? Well, welcome back. I mentioned that we Protestants, certainly including us Presbyterians, or whatever you call yourself, even if you don't call yourself Presbyterian, the fact that we pay so little attention to Ascension is to our loss. It's to our poverty, you might even say, because the ascension of Jesus is an important part of the gospel story. Now, there is one branch of Protestantism that pays more attention to Ascension and to the church calendar in general, and that is the Anglican Church, or as it is called in the United States, the Episcopal Church. But there is from England a popular Anglican hymn for Ascension Sunday that contains this line. Listen to this. Thou hast raised our human nature in the clouds at God's right hand. The ascension of Jesus in this context becomes a celebration of the miraculous fact that our very humanity, in all of its variety, all of its vulnerability, all of its messed upness, has been taken by Jesus in his ascension into the very heart of the divine life. Man with God is on the throne, the hymn continues, which is quite shocking when you think about it. The very humanity that we all know to be stained and wounded and imprisoned in various ways, this humanity, yours and mine, is still capable of being embraced by God, shot through, if you will, with God's glory, received and welcomed in the burning heart of reality itself. By putting on human flesh and keeping it on, Jesus has not only brought God down to us, he has also brought us up to God. So let's pursue that theme just a bit further. Jesus takes our human nature, our very flesh, yours and mine, to the heart of God, and he speaks to God his Father in an authentically human voice. You see, in heaven, the language that they speak is human. Now, not just English, mind you, but human. Not only angelic, not only languages far above and beyond us that we are incapable of understanding or of speaking, but it's our words, human words, that are heard at the very center of the universe. St. Augustine, who lived mostly in the 5th century, reflected on the significance of this in his many sermons on the Psalms. Like most of us who spent much time in the Psalms, Augustine was concerned that many of the Psalms seem downright rude, impolite. Certainly many of them are shot through with anger, others with doubt. It seems like this is the kind of stuff you don't really talk about in polite company, and at least not at church, because they are not at all in keeping with our traditional ideas about reverence and respect, especially not with that brand of piety that consists in bowed heads and meekly folded hands and lowered voices, because you wouldn't want to look God in the eye or say something disrespectful. The Psalms, on the other hand, are full of shrieks instead of whispers. And the various authors, for it wasn't just King David, but the various authors are as likely to be shaking a fist or wagging a finger at God as folding their hands meekly and quietly to pray. The Psalms contain many rude, angry, violent, even hateful remarks. They contain protests against God and rather spectacular ill-wishing against fellow human beings. The Psalms, which are the prayer book of the Bible, are about as human as it gets. And yet, and think of this, we still recite them in public worship. That's because they are a reminder of those aspects that are of our humanity, not only the ones that are high and holy, but the ones that are low down and not so hot, and maybe we think of them as being best hushed up and kept out of God's sight. Well, Augustine decided that not only is it of no use trying to hide our real selves from God, but that God has actually taken the initiative to make our language, even our emotions, his own. And therefore you have to imagine, as you say or hear the Psalms, the prayer book of the Bible, that Jesus himself is speaking them, which of course he did. They were his prayer book too. And there's another startling thought. Jesus saying, "Where are you, God?" Just like we do sometimes. Jesus saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why have you left me alone in the time of trouble?" But of course, you don't have to imagine that, because he really did say that in his time of deepest trouble. Or imagine Jesus saying, "Lord, I wish you'd take care of my enemies, okay? Would you just, zap them with lightning or give them a little cancer or something. Clear them out of the way. Or imagine Jesus saying things that are actually in the Psalms too, like, "Blessed are those who dash your children against the rocks." And goodness knows what else. Pick a psalm. There are 150 of them. Well, says Augustine, it doesn't mean that Jesus is telling us that any and every human cry or human wish or human emotion is good. It doesn't mean that Jesus endorses our ideas about revenge on our enemies or even shaking your fist at God the Father. But it does mean that Jesus treats us, our feelings, our tumultuous personalities, as real. He takes us, even us, seriously. He takes us seriously when we are moving toward God and each other in love. And amazingly, he takes us seriously when we are moving in the opposite direction, when we're spinning downward into destructive, hateful fantasies. He doesn't let go of us, and he doesn't lose sight of us when we seek to lock ourselves up in the dark. Jesus hears all the words we speak. Mind you, words of pain and protest and rage and violence. He hears them and he takes them, and in the presence of God the Father, he says, "This is the humanity I've brought home. It's not a pretty sight, Father. It's not always edifying or impressive or heroic. It's just real and needy and confused. And Father, my Father, here it is, this complicated humanity brought home to heaven." And that's what he does. He drops all of that, all of what we are, into the burning heart of God for healing and for transformation. Well, that's quite a lot to bear in mind when you're saying or reading the Psalms, but it's the best way to understand these very down-to-earth prayers in the middle of the Bible. Didn't you learn that if you went to Sunday school? If you want to find the Psalms, just kind of turn to the middle of the book. But all of that in Augustine's thinking arises from this basic truth, that Jesus ascends to heaven. It doesn't happen unless the human life in which God has made himself most visible and most tangible does not ascend, disappear, if you will, from the human world in its former shape and is somehow absorbed into the endless life of God. Think of this. When he goes, our humanity, all of it, the best and the brightest, the worst and the lowest, goes with him. Even the most difficult, resistant, and unpleasant aspects of our humanity are taken up into the heart of love, which is the only place where they can be healed, reconciled, and transformed. And so when Jesus speaks of the promise of the Father that is going to descend on the world, he's speaking of the way in which the gift of the Holy Spirit of God enables us not only to be a new kind of person, a new kind of people, but to see other human beings afresh and to hear them differently. And that is a wondrous and miraculous thing. You know, I've heard it said, and maybe you have too, that if there is anything good to eventually come out of the whole struggle that we've had with the coronavirus and the infection of COVID-19, it might be this, that we will somehow, hopefully, continue to be considerate of others as we've been during this time period, that we would continue to think, to be mindful of the needs of others, to protect them, just as we protect ourselves. To remember that people like the clerks in the grocery store are essential, just like we are essential. But you see, we've always known that, right? We've known that we are important. It's others that we have sometimes forgotten about. We have forgotten their significance. We have forgotten how essential they are to our own well-being. And so folks have made the observation that maybe, hopefully, we'll keep those things in mind even after we've taken off the face masks and stopped worried about leaving home. You know, that sounds great, and it would be wonderful if it could be true. And I believe that it can. But I believe as well that there's only one way that that can happen, and that is by the power of the Holy Spirit. We can see others differently, think of them differently, hear them differently, as truly important, as people truly and deeply beloved by God, and therefore essential and worthwhile to us. We can see and hear them that way, conceive of them in that new way, only by the power of the Holy Spirit. You see, when the Holy Spirit sweeps over us in the wind and the flame of Pentecost, the Holy Spirit gives us the life of Jesus. It gives us something of Jesus's capacity to hear what is really being said by other people, the meaning beneath the words. It gives us the courage not to screen out those bits of the human experience that are painful, unpleasant, or unedifying, but actually to open our eyes, our ears, and our hearts to the full range of what being human means. It means, perhaps, in an image that I have come to really cherish, it means to have a spacious heart, where there is truly room for others to be nothing different than what and who they really are. Think of that for a moment. What would it mean for you to have a spacious and unguarded heart toward others, so that instead of being somebody who needs to be sheltered from the rough truth of the world, we as followers of Jesus become people who are more and more open, more and more vulnerable to that great range of human experience, so that followers of Jesus are not in a position to censor out any bits of the human voice or the human experience, that troubling experience which so often draws in pain and anger and violence. And for us to recognize and to truly be open to that. And so that what we hear does not lead us to shrug our shoulders or to become defensive or to say, well, that's just human nature for you, which is really one of the least helpful phrases in the entire moral vocabulary that we humans possess. On the contrary, it would mean that we feel the edge, the ache in human anger and human suffering, and we recognize that even those things can be taken into Christ and through him into the heart of the Father so that they may be healed, so that those things, even those unseemly parts of ourselves, may be transformed, because Jesus has gone before us into the darkest places of human reality. He's picked up all the sounds that he hears. And think of what those sounds are. It's not just our singing in church, but it is the quiet cries of the abused child, the despairing tears of Syrian Kurds and others being shot, blown up, and gassed without respite or rescue, abandoned by their American allies. He picks up the cry of the hungry and the forgotten. He hears the people that nobody else hears, or the people that others block their ears to. And he calls us and he says, you listen too. He takes into himself the cynical dismissal of faith by the so-called sophisticated, and he sees right through that facade to the underlying need. He takes up into himself the pains and joys of our daily existence. As we say in the beloved Christmas carol, the hopes and fears of all the years are met in thee tonight. Well, it's really in the Ascension that the hopes and fears of all the years are gathered into his heart. He takes all of it, all of who and what we are, to the throne of God, so that, in the words of an old Scottish preacher, the dust of earth is on the throne of the Majesty on high. So, maybe now you think a little differently about Ascension. It really took me a long time to get there myself. Now we see that the Ascension is in part a celebration of the glory of humanity, the unlikely possibilities of people like you and me, the eternal potential locked up in our muddled and struggling lives. And it's a celebration, too, of God's capacity through his Holy Spirit to reach into those parts of humanity that are so far from glorious, that are rebellious and troubled and broken, and to breathe into them new life, to take them home, to drop them into the fire of his love, and to melt them, mold them, make them new altogether. The promise of the Father is that we, as Jesus followers, will receive that level and dimension of divine life that we call Holy Spirit, so that, like Jesus, we will find that nothing human is alien to us, just as nothing human is alien to God.